Welcome to Major Intonio's presentation of The Life of the Emperor Francis Joseph, by Francis Gribble, published in 1914. Preface.
There exist plenty of surveys of the modern history and political conditions of Austria. Mr. Henry Wickham Steed's The Habsburg Monarchy is the most recent and probably the best, though Mr. R.P. Mahaffy's Francis Joseph I, His Life and Times, a smaller and less pretentious book, is also very good. One knows equally well where to turn for gossipy compilations, some of them authoritative, and others devoid of authority, dealing with the inner life of the Austrian court. Sir Horace Rumbold has treated the subject with the dutiful reticence of a diplomatist in the Austrian court of the 19th century. Countess Marie Larisch and Princess Louisa of Tuscany, occupying positions of greater freedom and less responsibility, have in my past and my own story lifted the veil with indignant gestures and pointed fingers of scorn at the intimate pictures which they have revealed. M. H. de Weindel, again, has written of François-Joseph Intime. While the enterprise of an American journalist has contributed the keystone of empire, the martyrdom of an empress, and the private life of two emperors, William II of Germany and Francis Joseph of Austria. This bibliographical list, to which additions could easily be made, might seem to indicate that the ground has already been well covered, but that is not the case. There exists no life of Francis Joseph, and no history of Austria in which the personal and political aspects of the subject are considered in their relation to each other. The assumption of writers who have previously treated the theme has been that tittle-tattle is tittle-tattle, and that history is history, and that the two can never meet. The two things, however, are liable to meet anywhere, and in the country and period here under review, they are continually meeting. Austria is not one of the inevitable countries, like England and Spain, bound to have a separate existence under some form of government or other because of their geographical situation and the national characteristics of their inhabitants. There is no Austrian nation, only a medley of races which detest each other, bound, but by no means welded, together for the supposed convenience of the rest of Europe, and unified only by the fact that its component parts all appertain to the dominions of the House of Habsburg. It follows that the personality of the Habsburgs matters in a sense in which the personalities of rulers who are mere figureheads does not matter. And that personality, the collective personality, as well as the separate personalities of individual members of the House, can only be gauged by those who study their private lives in conjunction with their public performances. The history of the property, seeing that it comprises peoples as well as lands, includes and implies the history of the owners of the property. Our spectacle, insofar as one can sum it up in a sentence, is that of an empire continually threatened with dissolution under the control of an historic family, continually displaying all the symptoms of decadence. The political and the personal factors in the problem are perpetually interacting, and one of the questions which the political prophet has to consider is, will not the decadence of the family hasten the dissolution of the empire? Whence it follows, as a secondary sequence, that in the history of modern Austria, tittle-tattle matters, for it is only by the careful study of the tittle-tattle that we can hope to discover whether the Habsburgs of today are true or false to the proud and impressive traditions of their house. In their case, as in that of any other house, a stray story of a romantic or scandalous character might properly be ignored as appertaining to the domain of idle gossip. But when stories of that kind meet us at every turn, and meet us with increasing frequency as time proceeds, we are no longer entitled to dismiss them with superior indifference. They are significant. The key to the situation is to be found in them. Tittle-tattle, in short, when one encounters it, not in sample but in bulk, ceases to be tittle-tattle, but attains to the dignity of history, and furnishes the raw material for the generalizations of the political philosopher. The annals of the House of Habsburg furnish a case in point, the best of all possible cases. There is no house in Europe whose annals are richer in incident and eccentricity, and the eccentricities, whether romantic or scandalous, are such as to challenge the scientific investigator, whether he be a student of eugenics or of politics, to group them and see what inferences he can draw. The present writer has decided to take up the challenge, and in order to take it up, he will be obliged to deal with a good many matters besides the political maneuvers of the emperor and his ministers. John Orth pelting the emperor with the insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Herr Wulfling cracking nuts in a tree with Fräulein Adamovics. Princess Louisa of Tuscany first bicycling with the dentist in the Dresden Park, and then appealing to her son's tutor to come and compromise her in Switzerland. All these are matters which may suggest reflections quite as far-reaching as anything that we read about Francis Joseph's skill in extricating his country from embarrassments with rival powers and keeping the peace, insofar as it has been kept, between Ruthenians and Galicians. It would be presumption, of course, to represent this biography as the full and final portrait of Francis Joseph as he really is. The complete material for such a definite portrait of a sovereign is never made available during the sovereign's lifetime, and the portraits drawn by people who have occupied privileged positions at court are generally the most colorless of all, misleading and, as a rule, designed to mislead by excess of eulogy. Discretion, in such cases, takes the place of criticism. The selection is not that of the artist, but of the courtier. The illustrious personage thus officially or semi-officially portrayed comes out not as an individual, but as a type, as conventional and as unconvincing as the stock heavy father or gentlemanly villain of melodrama. Sir Horace Rumbold's polite portrait of Francis Joseph is one of many marked by those limitations. The popular Austrian portraits are still more distinctly marked by them. One need not wonder, and one must not complain. The path to candor was blocked by the obligations, in the one case of hospitality, and in the other of loyalty. But there is no reason why the historian who is not under such obligations should not criticize more freely. His object is neither depreciation nor flattery, but truth, as much of the truth as is attainable at the given moment. And he must therefore resist the common tendency of the biographers of contemporary rulers to credit their subjects, not only with their own particular virtues, but with all other people's virtues as well. The only result in moral portraiture of attributing virtues with too heavy a hand is to produce a picture in which the wood cannot be seen for the trees. That error must be avoided, as much in the interest of the subject of the portrait as in that of the public to which it is to be submitted. The real virtues will be more conspicuous if no imaginary virtues are allowed to block our view of them, and if other miscellaneous qualities which contrast with them are given their due tribute of attention. Cromwell, it will be remembered, insisted that the artist should paint him, warts and all. And if the life of an emperor is not to be written in that spirit, one might just as well refrain from writing it, for there would be nothing to be learnt from it when it was written.
Chapter 1.
In order to clear the way and set the stage for the drama of the Emperor Francis Joseph's life, we must go back to the dissolution of that Holy Roman Empire of which the Emperor of Austria was, at the end, the titular head. Happily, we have not very far to go. The Holy Roman Empire, in fact, as a cynic has said, neither holy nor Roman, and scarcely worthy to be called an empire, collapsed in the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, the world's earthquake, at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna, none of these things availed to set the Holy Roman Empire on its feet again. Perhaps a really great man might even then have been able to restore it and make something of it, using it as a decorative setting for glorious achievements. Perhaps not. The experiment was not tried, because there was no great man available to try it. The sovereigns of those days, with the sole exception of Alexander of Russia, were pitifully lacking in personal prestige. Whatever Napoleon had failed to do, he had at least succeeded in destroying the prestige of the hereditary representatives of ancient dynasties. The House of Habsburg, in spite of Napoleon's marriage to a daughter of the house, had suffered as much indignity as any other royal family, and more than most. That marriage, indeed, was itself esteemed an indignity. Even the old friends of the house were doubtful whether it still deserved respect. Moreover, while Austria was rather weak, Prussia was very jealous, not altogether without reason. In the earlier stages of the final combination against Napoleon, Prussia had borne the burden and heat of the day, while Austria sat with a double face, shilly-shallying on the fence. Now, it might be said, Austria represented the past and Prussia the future of the German world, and the future was in no mood to tolerate proud airs or lofty pretensions from the past. In the absence, therefore, of a commanding personality among the sovereigns, the revival of the Holy Roman Empire was impossible, and the center of gravity of the German world was shifting. Still, something had to be done. Some organization had to be contrived to give cohesion to the medley and provide the continental concert with a reasonable prospect of a quiet life. So there sprang into being two organizations which concern us. One, the German Federation, two, the Holy Alliance. Their detailed history need not delay us, but we must pause to see how they created the difficulties with which Francis Joseph, coming to throne as a boy of 18, had to cope, and posed the problems which he would have either to solve for himself or to see roughly, and even violently, solved for him by others. Just as the Holy Roman Empire was scarcely worthy to be called an empire, so the German Federation was scarcely worthy to be called a federation. It was loose and cumbrous, inefficient and inert. There was no federal tribunal, no federal army, no federal diplomatic machinery. In all these matters, the component states, ruled by 38 separate sovereigns, retained their independence. The Federal Assembly, which met at Frankfurt, was, in effect, only a congress of the ambassadors of those states, with the Austrian ambassador in the chair. No important step could be taken without the unanimous consent of the ambassadors, and there was no important piece of business on which they were all of one mind. The position of Austria at the head of the assembly was one of dignity without authority, conferring little more actual power than falls to the president of a debating society. So loose an arrangement obviously could not endure. One of two things was bound to happen. The bonds of union must, in the course of time, either be tightened or be broken. The seeds of destruction were present in the organization from the first in the shape of Austro-Prussian jealousy, that jealousy between the past and the future to which we have referred. The interests and aspirations of these two dominant states conflicted. Neither of them was strong enough to bring the other to heel. Neither of them was weak enough or humble enough to acquiesce in the other's hegemony. It remained only for one of them to turn the other out of the federation and fashion a real federation, a real empire, perhaps, out of the remaining constituents. That inevitable process, delayed for more than 50 years, but eventually altering the whole outlook of Austrian policy, was to provide the central problem of Francis Joseph's reign. But many other problems, hardly of less significance, were first to arise out of the program of the Holy Alliance. The Holy Alliance, of course, was in fact no more holy than the Holy Roman Empire, and was perhaps hardly worthy to be called an alliance. It was an agreement, or mutual understanding, rather than an alliance, inspired by hatred and terror of the new ideas disseminated by the French Revolution, and those are hardly unjust who describe it as a conspiracy, suggested by Metternich, and acquiesced in by the principal continental sovereigns, for keeping all subject peoples in the places which the Congress of Vienna had assigned to them. And that in a double sense. In the first place, autocratic forms of government were to be maintained in all countries which the Holy Three regarded as within their sphere of influence. In the second place, subject nationalities were to be kept in subjection to the powers which the settlement of 1815 had placed in authority over them. It follows that the policy of the Holy Alliance was a policy of sitting on safety valves, and its history is the history of a series of conferences and congresses held to decide who should sit on which safety valve in the name of all. It was agreed, for instance, that Austria should sit on the safety valve in Naples, and that France should sit on it in Spain. And there was much talk, though also much difference of opinion, about sitting on the safety valves in Portugal and Greece. The Holy Alliance fell to pieces after a much shorter life than that of the Holy Roman Empire, because Russia maintained against Austria and England maintained against France that certain safety valves should not be sat upon. Moreover, safety valves were many, and the upward pressure was of a continually increasing force. If Metternich and Castlereagh, and the emperors of Austria and Russia, and the King of Prussia, had, like the Bourbons, learnt nothing from the French Revolution and its sequel. The common people, from university professors to artisans, had learnt much. They might desire a breathing time before committing themselves to desperate courses. The breathing time might be protracted because the despotisms were reasonably benevolent towards people who did not meddle with politics, because the administration was honest and the taxes were not oppressive. Still, sooner or later, intelligent men were bound to tire of submission and clamor for parliaments and the recognition of nationalities. Byron, the friend of the Carbonari before he was the friend of Greece, was hounding them on to do so. In England, Byron was notorious for his indecorum, but on the continent, he was famous for his audacity. The improprieties of Don Juan did not shock continental liberals, but its courageous political criticisms stirred them. The lines over which they gloated, though they must have had a difficulty in translating them, were such lines as these. Lock up the Billy Bald Coot Alexander. Ship off the Holy Three to Senegal. Teach them that sauce for goose is sauce for gander, and ask them how they like to be in thrall. Such passages, and there are plenty of them, express the temper to which the continental liberals were gradually coming. When they came to it, and found such men as Metternich and Bomba of Naples and Charles X of France sitting on the safety valves, explosions could by no means be prevented. The political history of the period is the history of those explosions and their consequences. And we all know that there were two principal series of such explosions, the explosions of 1830 and the explosions of 1848. The noise of the first detonations was, as it were, a salute fired in the year of Francis Joseph's birth. The louder roar of the second greeted his accession. First Italy and then Hungary exploded, and Francis Joseph, as a boy of 18, had to face the confusion and try to calm it. The story of his bearing in the presence of the turmoil must not be anticipated, but we may look sufficiently ahead to note that a new Austria, differently constituted, and looking out of a new window in a new direction, had gradually to be recreated out of what might very well have been a wreck. The old Austria, over which Francis Joseph began to reign in 1848, was a Teuton power, holding the most prosperous provinces of Italy in its iron grip. That grip has been reluctantly relaxed until only the pressure of one little finger remains, and the new Austria over which Francis Joseph rules today has only a small Teuton nucleus, associated with a Magyar nucleus nearly as large, trying in conjunction with it to assert predominant partnership in a large and increasing community of Slavs, and casting envious but not very hopeful glances across the Danube towards the Balkan states and the Aegean harbors. So great has been the evolution accomplished within the reign of a single ruler, a ruler who, at the beginning of his reign, did not dare to set his foot in his own capital, and long before the end of it, had come to be regarded as the one indispensable man in the empire, the one man whose life must be preserved and prolonged at all hazards, for fear lest his death should entail the collapse of the edifice which he had reared, the one man who sometimes appeared to command the affection of all his subjects. It would be a striking story, even if one related the emperor's political achievements without reference to his personal life. But the two things, though commonly separated by political historians, are not really separable. Certainly they are not so separated by his own subjects. They not only admire the statesman who has acquired a prestige to which he was not born, and has used it to recover by diplomacy what he has lost in war, they also cherish an affectionate sympathy for the man at whom calamity has dealt blow after blow, whom no blow, however cruel, has struck down, and who, in spite of innumerable sorrows, has continued to confront the world with a dignified, if melancholy, composure. He has had, they perceive, no less trouble with his family than with his empire, and they have sometimes thought of him, or at least been tempted to think of him, as the one splendidly sane member of an eccentric and decadent house. It follows that one must write of Francis Joseph, not only as an emperor, but also as a Habsburg, the head of the most interesting of all the royal houses, a house whose members, unpredictable in their insurgent extravagances, have, again and again, moved the courts and chancelleries of Europe to consternation. Our picture must be not only of a great and successful ruler, but also of a brave old man, tried in the fire but not consumed by it, bowed down by sorrows but not broken by them, maintaining the medieval majesty of royal caste in the presence of his peers, at a time when other Habsburgs, one Habsburg after another, were flinging the prejudices of royal caste to the winds and making, as it must have seemed to him, sad messes of their lives, after the manner of those reprobate relatives who even in middle-class families are spoken of, if at all, with bated breath. That being our theme, or a portion of it, we may next speak of the Habsburgs collectively, and we will begin by considering what the eugenists have to say about them.
Chapter 2.
The House of Habsburg furnishes the horrible examples in two recent works on the new science of eugenics, L'hérédité des stigmates de dégénérescence by Dr. Galipe and L'origine du type familial de la Maison de Habsburg by Dr. Oswald Rubrecht. The arguments in both cases are based not only on a study of history, but also on a collation of portraits, and though the writers differ on some points of detail, their general conclusions are identical. For both of them, the Habsburgs are degenerates. Both of them attribute the degeneracy to the same cause. It is, they agree, the cumulative effect of what is technically called inbreeding, of a long succession of intermarriages among comparatively near relatives. One hears of the physiological law thus violated whenever the question of a marriage between cousins is mooted. The tendency of such a marriage, we are always told, is to perpetuate and accentuate typical characteristics and weaknesses, both physical and moral. A single marriage between cousins may produce no perceptible evil result, and one can cite cases in which it appears to have produced remarkably brilliant results. But a series of such marriages, continued through generation after generation, invariably and inevitably tells. The family or the community, in which such unions are the rule, loses vigor and develops peculiarities, a special, readily recognizable physiognomy, and an unstable mental equilibrium. The transmitted eccentricities, more particularly the mental eccentricities, may skip a generation or leave an individual exempt, but they are always lurking in the background, always to be expected to reappear. It has been so, and is so according to Drs. Rubrecht and Galipe, with the Habsburgs. We have all heard of the Habsburg jaw, and Dr. Rubrecht traces it to its medieval source. And standing before a long row of family portraits, carefully and scientifically depicts the Habsburg face, quote, "In addition to the underhung lower jaw and the large lower lip, the Habsburg physiognomy presents the following characteristic features: excessive length and sometimes excessive size of the nose, exorbitism, more or less pronounced, with a forehead often of considerable height. One would say that the head, squeezed in by lateral pressure, had undergone a concomitant vertical elongation and had been stretched and pulled up and down at the same time. According to Dr. Galipe, the lateral flattening of the skull is the fundamental characteristic, and all the other abnormalities follow from it." Unquote. That is what Dr. Rubrecht makes of the portraits. He generalizes only as a student of physiognomy and does not discuss mental and moral issues or presume to predict the future. Dr. Galipe is more outspoken. The Habsburgs, he writes, having by their intermarriages developed a degenerate taint, and having transmitted it either separately or in conjunction with other taints, both physical and psychical, to the families matrimonially allied with them, have brought into existence a specific type of human animal by the same means which the breeders of dogs and horses employ for the creation of a new subspecies. Unquote. As for the general consequences of such inbreeding, he continues, even those aristocratic families which present no original mark of degeneracy disappear quickly. It follows, a fortiori, that those families which possessing such characteristics perpetuate them by contracting marriages within the degrees of consanguinity are doomed to a still more speedy extinction. Unquote. As for the case of the Habsburgs in particular, he concludes, the Habsburgs of Spain have long since been swept off the stage of history, disappearing in sterility or insanity. The Habsburgs of Austria, numerous though the representatives of the house are at the present time, will end by disappearing in their turn as an historic family, if they persist in their errors, that is to say, in their marriages with blood relations. Unquote. It is a new way of looking at an old problem, a new thought suggested by the latest of the sciences, and it opens the door to reflections of great and urgent moment to many other royal houses besides that of Habsburg. In a general way, it has long been held to be almost as improper for kings and queens to marry their subjects as for angels to marry the daughters of men. A purer and bluer blood ran in their veins than in the veins of their subjects, and to adulterate that blue blood with red blood was to degrade it. They must, therefore, seek their brides and bridegrooms within the magic circle. Kings must marry queens, and princes must marry princesses, and the distinctive exclusiveness of reigning houses must be maintained by a succession of unions between cousins. That view of the matter has continued to prevail in royal circles, and also in high political and diplomatic circles, long after the students of heredity have established conclusions unfavorable to such courses. The arguments can hardly have failed to reach the ears of those whom they concerned, and the feeling, tacit if not avowed, has presumably been that kings and queens and princes and princesses are so great and good and glorious that the laws of nature do not apply to them. But that is not the case. Science shows that kings cannot override the laws of nature, even in the countries in which they are permitted to override the laws of the land. That the price which nature exacts for exclusiveness is degeneracy. That hardly any royal family anywhere has failed to pay that price. That the percentage of insanity has, through the ages, been higher among hereditary rulers whose blue blood has thus been protected from admixture than in any other class of the community, and that the sound physiological instinct is that on which King Cophetua acted in the legend when the barefooted beggar maid appeared before him. Quote, "As shines the moon in clouded skies, she in her poor attire was seen. One praised her ankles, one her eyes, one her dark hair and lovesome mien. So sweet a face, such angel grace, in all that land had never been. Cophetua swore a royal oath, this beggar maid shall be my queen." Unquote. It is this example of King Cophetua, and the moral which the eugenists read into it, that we shall need to bear in mind when we endeavor to appreciate those incidents in the latter-day history of the House of Habsburg, which are commonly supposed, whether rightly or wrongly, to have been most distressing to the head of the family. That history has largely, and indeed mainly, if not quite entirely, been a history of revolt on the part of the sons, and even the daughters, of the house against the splendid restrictions and inherited obligations which hedged them about as members of an uniquely illustrious race. The revolt has expressed itself in many ways, some of them, in the world's view, creditable and even honorable, others in a greater or less degree scandalous. We have seen, and we shall see yet again in these pages, one Habsburg throwing off the panoply of state to live his own mysterious life in the remote Balearic Isles, and another Habsburg disappearing forever, unless those are right who assure us that he bides his time in hiding for some dark political reason and will come again as the navigating officer of a merchant vessel. There have also been intrigues which have ended in tragedy, and morganatic marriages with actresses and other persons deemed impossible in imperial circles, and there has been at least one elopement of a Habsburg princess who, having failed to live harmoniously with the crown prince, found that even a professional pianist could not permanently satisfy her craving for romance. One knows the ordinary comment on these proceedings: all the Habsburgs are mad, all of them except Francis Joseph, and here is another Habsburg proving himself or herself as mad as the others, if not madder. The remark is not profound, but it is often, in a rough way, true. John Orth, her Wulfling, Princess Louisa of Tuscany, all these, and not these only, have done strange things. Things which one would hesitate to put forward as the sole and unsupported proofs of the possession of well-balanced minds. This is not the page for the detailed account of such proceedings, but it is pertinent and proper, even here, to remark the startling frequency of their occurrence. It is not a case of the discovery of a single skeleton in a single cupboard, a phenomenon which any research into any family history is apt to bring to light. The impression, when one reviews the recent annals of the House of Habsburg, is of continuous rattling of skeletons in all the cupboards, and of one sane and strong man, the accepted and now the hereditary head of the house, going gravely through his troubled life, not unmoved, indeed, by the ghostly noises, but, at least, without allowing his composure to be too visibly disturbed by them. A man of whom one may say, giving a somewhat new sense to old and hackneyed lines, Si fractus illabatur orbis impavidum ferient ruinae. But that is not the only view of the matter which it is permissible to take. One may also, with the conclusions of science to back one, regard the eccentricities of the more eccentric Habsburgs, if not as the best proofs of sanity that they are capable of giving, then as instinctive and desperate, if not always very intelligent, endeavors to escape from the imminent fate which the eugenists have foretold for them. The family, we may take it, no less than the individual, is an organism, albeit only partly conscious of itself, and our spectacle, we may add, is that of an organism blindly fighting for its life. The fight may not be very wisely conducted, not having been begun until the work of destruction was too far advanced. But it is nevertheless a fight worth fighting, and one of which we should follow the vicissitudes, not with horror or with merriment, but with intelligent sympathy. For degeneracy is too high a price to pay for haughty exclusiveness, and it is better to flee from the city of destruction late in the day, followed and attended by the cry of scandal, than to remain in it and be overwhelmed. That, at any rate, is the appreciation of the Habsburg scandals, or of a good many of them, which will commend itself to eugenists and sociologists, who will esteem the revolts sound in principle, even though they allow them to be occasionally extravagant in detail. The individual makers of the scandals need not be assumed to have acted from any higher or deeper motive than the satisfaction of what has more than once proved to be only a passing inclination. The whole circumstances of their upbringing and the precepts of duty and propriety impressed upon them from childhood make that unlikely. But the physiological instinct behind the admitted motive has been a sound one. Looked at from the viewpoint of the individual, it had been the instinct of King Cophetua. Looked at from the point of view of the race, it has been the instinct of self-preservation. It has been the tragedy, or one of the tragedies, of Francis Joseph, that the years of his reign have coincided with the years of this stage in the Habsburg struggle for continued existence. Chosen for his august and exalted post as the sanest and healthiest Habsburg available, albeit the son of an epileptic father and the nephew of an epileptic uncle, he has looked down from above on the exciting incidents and varying vicissitudes of that struggle. One does not know whether to regard his tragedy as the greater, on the assumption that he understood the inner meaning of the spectacle, or on the assumption that he did not understand it. In the former case, there would be more of pathos, in the latter case, more of irony, in the drama. But it is impossible to say for certain whether he has understood or not. The probability, in the lack of direct evidence, is that he has understood in part. One might draw that inference from his occasional indulgence, as well as from his occasional severity towards the rebels against the laws, both written and unwritten, of his house. And one has no right to infer the contrary from the fact that he himself has not rebelled. He is a Habsburg as well as an emperor, and may very well have felt the impulses which appear to have become common to the race, though he has had both exceptional reasons and exceptional facilities for repressing them. One knows at any rate that he, like so many other members of his family, has sought and won the friendship of women outside the charmed circle of the royal families, and that the lady in whose company he seems, in the last years of his long life, to find the most agreeable respite from the cares of state, is not an archduchess, and was once an actress. That fact must surely have helped him to understand. But these are matters for subsequent consideration. The ground is now clear, and we may proceed without further delay to genealogy and biography.
This concludes today's reading of the life of the Emperor Francis Joseph, by Francis Gribble. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.